Hollywood's golden age created the illusion of larger-than-life stars, towering figures who seemed untouchable on the silver screen. But behind the glamour, some of the most iconic actors weren't tall at all. In fact, many of them were surprisingly short, standing several inches below the average leading man or woman of their time. For some, their height became a constant challenge. Studios used camera tricks, clever costumes, and even box platforms to hide the truth from audiences. Others leaned into their size, turning what could have been a limitation into part of their charm. These are 14 vintage Hollywood stars who were really short. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney stood at just 5 feet 2 inches, making him one of the shortest leading men in Hollywood history. In a town that worshipped tall, chiseled heroes, his size should have held him back. Instead, Rooney became one of the biggest stars of the 1930s and 1940s. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in Brooklyn in 1920, Rooney grew up in vaudeville. He was a natural performer from the time he could walk, but even as a boy, people noticed his small stature. He never grew much taller, and by the time he reached adulthood, his short height was set. Instead of letting it discourage him, he leaned into his boundless personality, making himself seem bigger than he was. Hollywood embraced Rooney's charm early. His shortness actually worked in his favor. He looked younger than he was, which allowed him to play teenage roles well into his 20s. Fans adored him. He seemed approachable, real, and full of life. Not some distant, tall idol, but someone who could have lived down the street, but his height also came with struggles. When Rooney tried to transition from youthful roles into adult leading man parts, studios didn't always know what to do with him. Next to tall actresses and towering co-stars, he could appear childlike. Directors often paired him with shorter actresses or used clever camera tricks to even out the difference. While this worked on screen, Rooney himself admitted to feeling insecure at times. He once joked that Hollywood measured actors in feet, but measured him in inches. Rooney's short stature played into his relationships as well. Despite being small, he was magnetic to women, marrying 8 times in his lifetime. His first wife was none other than Ava Gardner, a towering beauty who was much taller than him. Their relationship became a Hollywood spectacle, with tabloids playing up the contrast between Gardner's height and Rooney's size, but Mickey's confidence and humor always carried him through. If anything, his shortness made him more beloved. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson stood at 5 feet 3, a height that in Hollywood's golden age could have been a curse. Leading men were supposed to be tall, handsome, and physically commanding. Robinson was none of those things. He was short, stocky, and had sharp, rugged features that didn't fit the matinee idol mold. Yet somehow, he turned what many saw as weaknesses into his greatest strengths, becoming one of the most unforgettable actors of classic cinema. Born Emanuel Goldenberg in Romania in 1893, Robinson moved with his family to New York as a boy. From the beginning, he knew he wasn't the tallest or the most striking, but he was fiercely intelligent and determined. Where others had charm in their looks, Robinson had it in his voice, his intensity, and his unshakable confidence. His big break came with Little Caesar, 1931. The studio had originally wanted taller, more conventionally handsome actors for the role of Rico, a ruthless gangster clawing his way to the top. But once Robinson auditioned, there was no question. He was Rico. His short stature actually made the performance more believable. Audiences saw a man who didn't tower physically, but through sheer willpower and aggression, dominated everyone around him. Robinson's height became part of his menace. It was proof that power doesn't always come in tall packages. Still, his height did limit him in certain ways. Robinson was rarely offered romantic leading roles. He didn't get the chance to sweep women off their feet in glamorous love stories like Clark Gable or Cary Grant did. Instead, studios typecast him in gangster films, detective roles, and tough guy parts. He longed to show his range and often fought to take on different kinds of characters. But the image of the short, fiery gangster followed him throughout his career. Robinson was married twice and had one son, Edward Jr. Despite his fame, his height and unusual looks sometimes made him self-conscious, especially in a town obsessed with physical perfection. He once admitted that he never felt like a conventional star, but rather a character actor who had stumbled into stardom. Yet those close to him knew he carried himself with dignity, intelligence, and quiet pride. Harry Langdon. Harry Langdon stood at just 5 feet 2, a height that made him one of the shortest comedians of the silent film era. His size, paired with his wide-eyed, innocent expression, created a persona that audiences found both funny and strangely touching. Born in Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1884, Langdon was not destined for a life of glamour. He worked odd jobs before drifting into vaudeville, where his small stature immediately set him apart. On stage, he developed a man-child character, an adult who seemed permanently puzzled by the world. His short height made the act believable. He looked fragile, almost delicate, which only made the humor stronger when life's absurdities overwhelmed him. When he moved into films in the 1920s, Langdon's size became part of his screen identity. In an era dominated by physical comedians who relied on stunts and athleticism, Langdon offered something different. His humor was slower, quieter, more awkward. The audience loved him. At the peak of his career, Langdon was considered one of the big 4 silent comedians, alongside Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd. He may have been the smallest in size, but his films drew massive crowds. Fans connected with the idea of a little man trying to make sense of a big, confusing world. But Langdon's short stature typecast him. He was often trapped in childlike roles. Hollywood didn't know what to do with a 5'2" man who wanted to grow into more mature characters. When he tried to take more control of his career, directing his own films and experimenting with new styles, audiences didn't respond as strongly. His box office appeal faded quickly by the late 1920s, especially as sound films arrived. Langdon married twice and had children, but his relationships were often strained by his career struggles. Some biographers suggest that his insecurities about his size and his fading stardom weighed heavily on him. Langdon never truly disappeared. He continued working in smaller films, sometimes appearing in supporting roles or comedy shorts, right up until his death in 1944. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was only 5 feet 5, but when he stepped on stage, he seemed 10 feet tall. In an industry that often prized leading men with towering presence, Davis defied the odds, building a career so dazzling that his height became almost irrelevant. Still, his short stature was a constant part of how audiences, producers, and even friends viewed him. Born in Harlem in 1925, Sammy grew up in show business. As a child, he toured with his father and uncle in the Will Maston Trio, dancing before he was old enough for school. His small frame actually worked to his advantage at first. On stage, he looked like a cute miniature version of the adults around him, and audiences adored the novelty. But as he grew older, the same height that once seemed charming became a hurdle. Hollywood in the mid-20th century liked tall stars, especially leading men. At 5 feet 5, Davis was shorter than most of his peers. He was well aware of it and leaned into his strengths instead. Where he lacked in height, he made up for in raw talent. Singing, dancing, acting, playing multiple instruments, and doing impressions that could bring down the house. His friends in the Rat Pack were taller, but Davis never let himself fade into the background. Davis's size was sometimes a subject of quiet gossip. Women adored him, but Hollywood insiders often remarked on the contrast when he dated taller actresses. He was often teased about his size, but Davis never let it define him negatively. If anything, his height sharpened his sense of humor. He joked about it often on stage, delivering lines that disarmed critics before they could use his stature against him. That humor, along with his endless drive, helped him endure an industry that wasn't built to celebrate short men. Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre stood just 5 feet 3, one of the shortest actors in classic Hollywood. In an era where leading men were tall, broad-shouldered, and conventionally handsome, Lorre carved out a place for himself in a completely different way. His height made it difficult to land romantic roles, but it also gave him a strange, unforgettable presence that directors and audiences never forgot. Born in Austria-Hungary in 1904, Lorre had an unusual look and a soft, accented voice that instantly set him apart. His breakthrough came in Germany with Fritz Lang's M, 1931, where he played a terrifying child murderer. The role launched him to international fame, but it also typecast him. In Hollywood, producers quickly realized that Lorre's height, piercing eyes, and unsettling energy were perfect for villains, outcasts, and mysterious figures. His short size added to his mystique. On screen, he could appear vulnerable one moment and sinister the next. His stature forced him to rely on acting skills rather than presence alone, and that became his strength. Lorre often felt insecure about his height. He joked about his size, but also carried the quiet awareness that he would never be cast as the dashing lead. Lorre's height never fully blocked his romantic life. He married 3 times and had 1 daughter, but gossip columns sometimes painted him as the quirky little man rather than a heartthrob. His marriages, like much of his personal life, were complicated by struggles with health and addiction. Morphine dependence, which began after surgery, shadowed his later years and often worsened his insecurities. Still, fans adored him. While many stars came and went, Lorre stood out because he didn't try to be something he wasn't. His small size became part of his identity as Hollywood's master of the eerie and strange. George Gobel. George Gobel wasn't a towering figure in Hollywood, literally. Standing at just 5'5" with a soft, boyish face and a slightly timid voice, Gobel was the kind of man people underestimated at first glance. Born in Chicago in 1919, Gobel started out not as a performer, but as a country and western singer on local radio. His small stature and mild demeanor didn't exactly scream star material in an era dominated by loud personalities and strong-looking leading men. But Gobel quickly discovered his unique advantage. He didn't need to compete with tall, handsome stars. He could simply play the role of the everyman, the little guy viewers at home could relate to. His career took off with The George Gobel Show in the mid-1950s. On television, his height and quiet presence actually worked in his favor. Where most comedians of the time were big and brash, Gobel's comedy was understated, dry, and self-deprecating. He leaned into his small size, often joking about it directly, turning what could have been a weakness into his signature charm. His small frame and gentle voice made his humor sharper, funnier, and often more memorable. He understood that being the little man gave him a unique position in the comedy world, and he played it masterfully. Gobel was happily married to his wife Alice, whom he often referenced affectionately in his routines. Their relationship grounded him, even as his fame grew. His family man reputation, coupled with his short height and ordinary appearance, made fans feel even closer to him. He wasn't intimidating. He was approachable, like the funny neighbor everyone wished they had. George Gobel stood just 5'5", but he built a career that loomed large over 1950s entertainment with his gentle humor, family man image, and to turn his short stature into comedy gold. Ross Martin. Ross Martin stood just at 5'7", which was on the shorter side for male leads in his era, but he carried himself with such wit and charm that audiences hardly noticed. Born in 1920 in Poland and raised in New York City, Martin had an early love for performing. In Hollywood, however, his height and bookish look meant he wasn't considered the typical hero. While tall actors were cast as rugged cowboys or action stars, Martin often found himself competing for supporting roles. Instead of fighting against it, he leaned into his strengths: intelligence, character work, and the ability to disappear into roles. His big break came in 1965. Martin's height played into his reputation as a chameleon. Because he wasn't towering or traditionally imposing, he could slip into a variety of roles, from villains to diplomats to comic relief. His versatility kept him working steadily, and audiences came to appreciate him as one of the most adaptable actors of his generation. Martin's personal life was more private. He was married twice and his second marriage to Olive Grenage lasted until his untimely death. Friends and colleagues often spoke of his warmth, humor, and intelligence. While he sometimes joked about being shorter than many of his peers, he didn't let it define him. Instead, he built a reputation as a hard-working professional who made the most of every opportunity. Tragically, Martin died of a heart attack in 1981 at only 61. Jackie Cooper. Jackie Cooper stood only about 5'7" as an adult, but he began his career when height wasn't the issue. His age was. Cooper was one of Hollywood's earliest child stars, becoming famous in the 1930s. At just 9 years old, he earned an Academy Award nomination for Skippy, 1931, making him the youngest actor ever nominated for Best Actor. But Cooper's height and build shaped his later career in subtle ways. He never shot up to the tall, imposing stature that leading men of the 1940s and 1950s often needed. Cooper didn't give up. Instead of chasing roles he couldn't win, he reinvented himself. He served in the Navy during World War II, and when he turned to directing and producing, proving his talent went far beyond acting. By the 1950s, he was working steadily in television, both in front of and behind the camera, and even won Emmy Awards for directing. His height, once a potential obstacle, no longer mattered. He had matured into a Hollywood craftsman rather than just a former child star trying to hang on. Cooper was known as a devoted family man. He married 3 times and eventually found lasting happiness with his third wife, Barbara Ray Krause, with whom he had children. His family gave him the stability that Hollywood often denied him, and he frequently said that his happiest role was not on screen, but at home. Jackie Cooper represented resilience. He wasn't the tallest actor, nor the most glamorous, but he had grown up before their eyes and managed to hold on to his dignity in an industry that rarely spared its child stars. James Cagney. James Cagney was just 5'5", yet he became one of the most unforgettable leading men in Hollywood history. Cagney proved that charisma, intensity, and sheer talent could tower over any physical limitation. Born in New York City in 1899, Cagney grew up in a rough neighborhood, and that grit followed him into his acting career. His small stature never allowed him to play the imposing strong man, but it gave him an edge. On screen, he was quick, wiry, and unpredictable, like a street fighter who relied on speed and brains instead of bulk. Cagney's height actually helped him stand out. He didn't fit the mold of tall and suave leading men, so he leaned into a different image, the fiery, tough-talking underdog, and fans loved it. They saw him as someone scrappy enough to take on anyone, no matter their size. His dancing background also gave him a unique physicality. He moved with energy and precision, whether in a fist fight or a musical number. In fact, his performance in Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942, showed the world that the little tough guy could also sing, dance, and charm his way into America's heart. Cagney's height was rarely an issue in his personal life. He married Frances Vernon in 1922, and their marriage lasted more than 60 years until his death. Rare in Hollywood, and he and his wife raised 2 children. His short stature affected how studios worked with him. Directors often had to adjust camera angles or pair him with shorter actresses so he wouldn't look outsized on screen. But none of that stopped him. Audiences didn't come to Cagney for height or glamour. They came for fire, energy, and authenticity. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd was only 5'6", yet for a time in the 1940s and 1950s, he was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Ladd's short stature posed a real challenge, but with his piercing blue eyes, quiet intensity, and undeniable screen presence, he became proof that height wasn't everything in the business of stardom. Born in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1913, Ladd faced hardship early on. By the time he reached Hollywood, his lean build and modest height made it difficult to land leading roles. His height was a constant issue behind the scenes. Directors carefully arranged sets, camera angles, and even props to disguise the difference, when he acted opposite taller co-stars. In romantic scenes, Ladd often stood on boxes or platforms to appear taller next to leading ladies. Fellow actors, including the much taller Veronica Lake, were paired with him specifically because their smaller stature made the height gap less noticeable. The illusion worked on screen. Ladd looked every inch the leading man. His characters weren't the loud, swaggering types. They were quiet, reserved, and smoldering. That difference made him relatable, especially to audiences who weren't looking for another towering hero. Ladd was deeply aware of his height and how it shaped his career. Friends said he carried a certain insecurity about it, though he rarely spoke openly. He married twice and had 3 children, including actor David Ladd. The constant scrutiny of his stature, along with the fading of his stardom in the late 1950s, took a toll. Struggles with depression and alcohol haunted him in his later years. And tragically, he died in 1964 at just 50 years old. Frankie Darrow. Frankie Darrow was just 5'3", but for a time in the 1930s and 1940s, he was one of the busiest young actors in Hollywood. His short stature shaped his career in unusual ways, sometimes helping him play younger than his real age, and other times holding him back from the kind of leading roles he dreamed of. Born in Chicago in 1917, Darrow grew up in a circus family, where small size was an advantage for acrobatic stunts. That background gave him agility and confidence, which later translated to the screen. Throughout the 1930s, Darrow starred in a series of B-movies and action pictures, often as the spirited kid who wouldn't back down from a fight. His short size made him convincing as a youthful rebel well into his 20s, allowing him to keep playing teenage roles longer than most actors. But as he got older, producers struggled to see him as a mature leading man. At 5'3", with a boyish face and small frame, Darrow found himself typecast. Still, he never stopped working. One of his most surprising contributions to Hollywood came not from his face, but from his voice. He provided the speaking voice for Lampwick, the mischievous boy who turns into a donkey in Disney's Pinocchio, 1940. Darrow's life was more difficult off-screen. Like many child actors, he struggled to find his footing as he aged out of youthful roles. His height didn't help, while taller actors transitioned more easily into adult parts. Darrow's small stature made him look out of place in romantic or commanding roles. To make ends meet, he sometimes worked outside Hollywood, including stints as a bartender and even running his own tavern. Frankie Darrow's later years were quieter, though he continued to take occasional acting jobs in television and films. He passed away in 1976 at age 59. Bobby Breen. Bobby Breen was just 5'1", a fact that shaped nearly every turn of his Hollywood journey. In the late 1930s, he was one of the most famous child stars in America, a boy soprano with a voice so pure and angelic that audiences often compared him to a gift from heaven. But like many small-framed child stars, Breen's height became both his greatest blessing and his deepest obstacle. Born in Montreal in 1927 to Ukrainian Jewish parents, Bobby Breen was the youngest of 4 children. His family recognized his extraordinary singing talent early, and by the time he was 10, he was appearing on radio programs across the United States. Hollywood came calling soon after, and Breen starred in a series of popular musical films for RKO and Universal. On screen, his short stature and boyish frame worked to his advantage. He looked younger than his actual age, which extended his time as America's little tenor. But as he grew older, Bobby Breen faced the same painful reality that many child stars endured. His height and youthful appearance locked him in boyhood roles, even as he longed to grow into an adult career. At just over 5 feet tall, he never developed the commanding physical presence expected of male leads in Hollywood musicals. Breen leaned on his family, who had managed much of his career during his childhood. His parents remained supportive, but even they couldn't shield him from the heartbreak of losing the spotlight. In adulthood, Breen married and eventually moved away from Hollywood, focusing instead on music in nightclubs and stage performances. He never escaped the shadow of his child stardom, but he carried it with dignity. Bobby Breen passed away in 2016 at age 88. long after his days of stardom had faded. Angelo Rossitto. Standing at just 2 feet 11 inches, Angelo Rossitto was one of the shortest actors ever to appear in Hollywood films. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1908 to Italian immigrant parents, Rossitto grew up in a world that wasn't built for someone his size. But what he lacked in height, he more than made up for with charisma and persistence. His break came in the late 1920s, when silent film star John Barrymore noticed him at a street corner in Los Angeles and encouraged him to try acting. Angelo's appearance was striking, tiny yet expressive, with large, soulful eyes that could shift from innocence to menace in a single look. By 1927, he was cast in Old San Francisco, launching a career that would stretch for more than 60 years. Rossitto's stature often meant he was given roles that other actors would never consider: dwarfs, gnomes, grotesque villains, or exotic background characters. Despite the typecasting, Angelo was admired by fans for his dedication. He worked alongside some of the biggest stars of his era and always brought depth to roles that could have been played as cheap novelty. Even in his 70s, Rossitto was still commanding the screen. His height influenced how the industry saw him, but it didn't define how his friends and family viewed him. Angelo was described as warm, funny, and incredibly loyal. He married and lived a relatively private life away from the spectacle of Hollywood. Unlike many stars with his level of recognition, he never seemed consumed by bitterness. Instead, he built a life where acting was just one part of his story, not the whole of it. Barty. Billy Barty was only 3 feet 9 inches tall, but he managed to build a reputation as one of the most energetic and versatile entertainers in Hollywood. Born in 1924 in Millsboro, Pennsylvania, Barty was diagnosed with cartilage, hair hypoplasia, a form of dwarfism that kept him under 4 feet tall throughout his life. Instead of letting it hold him back, he leaned into his size with humor, talent, and relentless drive. He began performing as a child actor in the late 1920s, appearing in the Mickey Maguire comedy shorts alongside a young Mickey Rooney. Even at that age, his tiny frame made him instantly memorable. But what truly won over audiences was his enthusiasm. On screen, Billy never looked like he was playing small. He moved with speed and energy, almost like he was larger than life in a body that couldn't keep up. His comedic timing, willingness to take physical risks, and expressive face made him a scene stealer in everything he did. His height inevitably shaped his personal life too, especially in Hollywood, where leading men were expected to be tall and commanding. But Barty never let it stop him from pursuing happiness. He married Shirley Bowling in 1962, and the couple had 2 children. By all accounts, his family adored him, and his marriage was long-lasting, rare for the film industry. If these surprising stories of old Hollywood's shortest stars gave you a new perspective on movie legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell for more hidden truths from the golden era. Do you know another vintage star who stood small in height but tall in talent? Drop their name in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.